Storycrafting. So this is a series I want to develop where I talk about how stories are actually made. We'll talk about things like different tropes, different act structures, how to write good characters, that sort of thing. In each video, I'll focus on one specific topic that's, related to storytelling. Usually it'll be a technique, but sometimes it'll just be a way to look at stories. I might even talk about specific choices I made in my own stories. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Bechdel Test.
And have you noticed how your boobs have started to firm up?
So the Bechdel Test, you've probably heard of it. It was created by a comic strip artist named Alison Bechdel. Unfortunately, I can't say the name of the title of her comic on YouTube because it contains a slur about gay women specifically. Presumably, since she is a gay woman, it's actually the slur being reclaimed in a good way. So it's not a slur in the context of the comic. I don't know, I haven't actually read the comic. I feel like I should point out also that Alison Bechdel herself doesn't like the name the Bechdel Test. She doesn't want us to call it that. She believes that her friend Liz Wallace should get most of the credit, and so she would prefer it to be named the Bechdel-Wallace Test. For this video, since it's popularly called the Bechdel Test, I'm just going to keep calling it that. But I did want to make sure that Liz Wallace got her credit. So there's two versions of the test. There's the test as it's published in the comic strip, but it has evolved over time. So now there's a more commonly understood version of the test. That's what I'm going to focus on. There are three rules. A story passes the Bechdel test if it has two women, preferably named, who have a conversation with each other with no men involved about anything other than a man. Now, let's break down these three rules. Let's look at them. So, we need two women, and they need to be important enough to the story to have names. Obviously, this is about representation and characterization. We need to see better developed female characters. If all your female characters are only there to please the men, you're not going to pass the test. It is a common technique to make a story about a man and give him a woman as a love interest. That woman doesn't usually get developed and is treated as an object or a reward for the man. The big blockbuster action flicks of the 80s and 90s have lots of great examples of this. Indiana Jones, of course, particularly the second and third movies. Well, the second one. Demolition Man, kind of guilty of this. In fact, any movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone probably does this. Now, a movie can be good, even great, even without female characters or without very many of them. The problem is when every movie is made like that. I mean, you go out in the world and there are women out there, they're real people. Stories should be reflecting our experiences in some way. So this rule is really about making sure that there are female characters in a story that are important enough to the story to get named. And while we would like to be able to relate to these characters, it's not really a requirement for the test. We don't have to relate to them. We can hate them. All right, so the second rule, they have to talk to each other. This, of course, is related to the problem where you can have a good female character, but if she only ever talks to men, we're not really seeing women interacting with each other. Now, the rule doesn't mean there can't be any men present. Men can be present. They just can't be part of the conversation. So, famously, Star Trek Insurrection passes the Bechdel test because of a conversation that happens between Dr. Crusher and Troy, and Data is there for the conversation. And Data, of course, is a man. Well, the male android, close enough. And so this gets at a fundamental problem where women are often depicted as being entirely dependent on men, which if they were dependent on men, they wouldn't be able to talk to each other. And then, of course, the conversation has to be about anything other than a man, anything at all. And this gets at the harmful stereotype that women are only interested in getting married and having babies. Women obviously have other interests, so we need to be able to see that in our stories. There's an exception. Gay women are allowed to discuss their relationships because their relationships would be with women. And, of course, by talking about anything that's not even tangentially related to marriage and family, we can see women having real interests and real personalities. I don't know if this rule applies if the two characters are talking about ways to defeat the villain, who happens to be a man. So in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, during that part when Angel went evil because apparently I don't even want to go into that. That's a silly story. Anyway, so during that period, when Buffy and Willow are talking about how to defeat Angel, technically that wouldn't pass the test because Angel is a man. But I think it should still pass because they're talking about how to defeat the villain and they're being heroic and so forth. And so the point of the test is satisfied. There is a fourth criteria that often gets ignored in these conversations. The scene has to actually take place. We have to see it. It's not good enough if you have two men talking and one of the men mentions, my wife was talking to her friend or blah, blah, blah. You name both women. If that conversation would have passed the test, it's not good enough if a man relays the conversation as having happened. We need to see it. On screen, we need to see it. So, is it a fair test? Sort of. Remember, it comes from a comic strip. It's not a scientifically rigorous kind of test. So, in my book, this one, it's told from a first-person point of view, but the lead character is gender fluid. So he spends part of the character as a man, or part of the book as a man, and part of the book as a woman. If you accept him as a woman, which you should, then this book will pass the test. Because there's another woman on his team, and there are times when they are talking about stuff involved in the story. However, in my rehab book, which is called A Ghost in Time, it's a murder mystery that takes place in a rehab. It's also first person, but the main character is a man. So while it is possible he might be present for a conversation between two women that would pass the test, it's not likely, and it's not really something I would be looking to do in that book because it takes place in rehab, and addiction affects your relationships, and so part of the treatment is to talk about your relationships. It would probably be more useful to show two women talking about how their addictions have affected their relationships with men than it would be to try to pass the test here. Now, the point of the test is that it's a cheeky way to show how stories often fail to present good female characters. So in terms of fairness, if Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Star Trek Voyager, both featuring strong female leads, if they both consistently fail the test, that would be a big problem. But the Bechdel test is also literally the lowest bar for them to cross. They have much more important things to worry about. Indiana Jones, on the other hand, doesn't really need to pass the test because it's set at a time period when you don't really have a lot of women in science, and so you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of women around Indiana Jones. But a modern movie with basically the same story set in modern times, we would expect to see women on the team. And so they should be able to pass the test. So what does it mean exactly if you fail the test? And that really depends on the story. So if you look at, say, the original Star Trek series, it would just mean they made the show in the 60s. The 60s isn't exactly well known for portraying women on the screen. If The Next Generation, however, failed the test, which was made in the late 80s, early 90s, then that would mean they failed to live up to their ideals. But if you take a movie like Castaway or Life of Pi, which I haven't seen, but they feature one male character, I wouldn't expect them to pass the test. Obviously, you need two characters, and they both need to be women. But when you look at the big action blockbusters, it is meaningful that they fail pretty much all the time. The women in those movies are treated as a reward for the heroic man, and they're kind of ignoring that women can be heroes. In real life, women are heroes all the time, and we really need to see women as being more like partners or genuinely useful sidekicks. So if you do Batman and Robin's a woman, that would be fine. And of course, a big action movie could feature a female lead, like the Lara Croft stories, and still fail the Bechdel test simply because there aren't enough characters. Now, my book, Fastburger, which is also not finished yet, it's an ensemble piece. The basic idea here is you have a fast food place, you have a bunch of people working there, it's about to get busy, there's a lot of customers, and the whole thing gets teleported to an alien world, so it's a survival story. As an ensemble piece with plenty of female characters, if I were to fail the Bechdel test in Fastburger, that would be a huge problem. Because the women of Fastburger are heroic and strong people. And I also want to show people being vulnerable and having flaws, so yeah, there's going to be lots of conversations. So what does it mean to pass the test? Well, for an individual story, it doesn't mean a lot. But let's say the original Star Trek series actually passes the Bechdel test every 5th or 6th episode or so. that would make it very progressive for a 60s show. But if the Next Generation only passed the test every 5 or 6 episodes, that would be bad. And I think that actually does happen in a few seasons. But the movies featuring the cast from the original series, since they were made in the 80s, we should expect them, at least some of them, to pass the test. And I honestly don't know how many of them do. But the top 3 leads from that cast are still men. And they're going to get a lot of screen time. There may not be time to fit in a conversation between 2 women. But if you look at a show like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or especially Cagney and Lacey, which has 2 female leads, passing the Bechdel test is literally the lowest bar for them to reach. So while individual stories passing isn't necessarily meaningful, it does mean something if you look at an entire body of work and it never passes. So if you look at all heroic fantasy stories, the chosen one's always a man or whatever. If those stories never pass, that's a problem for the genre. The previously mentioned scene in Insurrection, even though it passes, it's still a problem. So for reference, they're on a planet that has reverse aging properties, and you have these 2 kind of middle-aged women commenting on how the reverse aging process is happening and how they can feel it. It's a believable conversation between 2 women in a situation like that. We would expect that kind of conversation to happen. However, they're talking about their boobs, so it really feels like the scene was included to gratify the male audience. Well, the male part of the audience. So passing the test on the basis of that conversation is actually problematic for Star Trek. All right, so what are good reasons to fail the test? Well, if you have a story led by a man and a woman, you expect them to be in most scenes, probably all of them. There may just not be a conversation that happens between 2 women without the male lead there. There may not even be a conversation between 2 men without the female lead there. Of course, it still has to be relatively short work, because the longer it gets, the more we're going to see some of these other scenes. So we should expect to see the woman talking to another woman at some point. Who else is she going to talk to? I mean, there are other men to talk to, sure, but of course, if this same story with the male and female leads shows the man talking to another man about anything other than a woman, then we should expect to see a similar scene with the woman. That would be a problem if there wasn't. Of course, a movie that only has 1 character will not pass the test, because you have to have 2 characters. But it is a problem if every story that only has 1 character has a man, because there are plenty of ways women can be in that situation. But I think if a story has only 1 character and that character is a woman, it should pass. She'll talk to herself, that counts. If a movie is centered around purely male things, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to pass. So, for example, a movie about drag queens, on the surface it sounds like they should pass, but the reality is a defining trait of drag queens is that they identify as men. Sometimes they call themselves female impersonators. You actually need 2 female characters. Now, if you have someone with a male body who's presenting as female and identifying as female, that person is not a drag queen. That person is a transgender woman. But it would be hard to tell a story about drag queens without including their female friends as characters, so we would still expect it to pass the test at some point. You could have a movie about an NFL team. It's problematic that the NFL doesn't let women play, but a movie about that team wouldn't be expected to have a lot of female characters. So it wouldn't be a big concern if it didn't pass the test. We would at least expect to see a man and a woman having a conversation that's not about relationships, and they're not flirting with each other, they're just having a conversation. We would expect to see that. Historical war dramas, many of those we don't expect to pass the test, because they're not going to have any female characters to begin with, or if they do, they're going to be talking about how concerned they are for the men being at war. That would be part of the story. So like A Bridge Too Far, which is about Operation Market Garden, I don't think there are any female characters in the whole movie. But then you have a movie like Pearl Harbor, which has important female characters, people who are important to the story. And it should pass. According to BechdelTest.com, it doesn't. And of course, any historical war drama that takes place on the home front or includes a resistance movement, we would expect those to pass. A current war drama would be iffy, because while women are allowed to serve in combat roles now, there aren't really a lot of them in those roles. And telling those stories, you could easily have a situation where you do a good job portraying the woman as being heroic and strong, but because she's the only character, in that squad or whatever, she doesn't have an opportunity to talk to other women. But a futuristic war drama, especially a science fiction one, should pass the test handily. So a movie like Starship Troopers should pass the test, and it does. Now, I use the Bechdel test as a story writing technique. I want to write believable, lovable, and heroic female characters. So passing the Bechdel test is kind of important in that case. And even when I want to use a female character as a reward for a man being heroic, he needs to be a reward for her too. It has to be reciprocal. Also, she will be participating. She'll be on the team in some form. So she'll be also part of the whatever heroic thing they did. Of course, it does kind of go out the window, passing the Bechdel test, when you have a first-person narrative with a male lead, because writing a scene where he's not participating in the conversation, but you have two women who are talking about something other than a man, is kind of difficult. I mean, it can happen, but you don't really expect to see it. And it could wind up feeling like you shoehorned the scene in, and that would take both the reader and the writer out of the story. You don't want to do that. But when you consider that women and men are far more alike than they are different, like my rehab therapist always says, then you should be able to write good female characters if you can write good male characters. It's not that hard. If you can write a character named Dave, you can write a character named Lisa. They're not that different from each other. They want the same things from relationships, for example. You know, companionship, love, and affection, great sex, and just a fun life. Women want those things too. If you're a man writing a female character and you're deliberately trying to make her feminine, you're probably also using harmful sexist tropes that are in turn built on harmful sexist stereotypes. And you may wind up passing the Bechdel test, but because you treated your women disrespectfully, it doesn't count. It doesn't really matter. But this is all kind of why it makes sense this comes from a comic strip, because passing the test doesn't make you a feminist, but caring about the test does. Now, I'd like to propose a corollary to the Bechdel test. And by that I mean a story can be considered as honorarily passing the test, even if it doesn't, if it satisfies the conditions of the corollary. Here are the conditions. You have two male characters, both of them named. They talk to each other about women. They express vulnerability and talk about difficulty in their relationships with women. But the difficulty can't be caused by the woman being unreasonable, and the women involved can't be presented as nags or crazies. And I think this should be a way you can still pass the test, because you're still elevating the women to importance to the story, importance to the men. You're not relying on harmful sexist stereotypes to depict the women. So there you go. If you want to name this corollary after me, I want it to be called Dave's Corollary to the Bechdel-Wallace Test. If I get credit for anything involved in this, then Liz Wallace should get credit too. So that's it. That's the Bechdel test. Thank you for watching this video. If you like it, please like and subscribe and ring the bell. You know the drill, like you do on every channel. If you'd like to support the channel directly, you can join my Patreon. It's just $3 a month right now, and I'll put your name in the credits. There's no credits right now. I think you know what you need to do. Of course, I am a science fiction writer. That's the whole point of the channel. You can go to Amazon and you can buy one of my books. That will also directly support the channel. Of course, links are in the description. Blah, blah, you know this. Everybody else says most of the same things, but I say it better.